Okay, if there's no problem with that, we'll confirm that. Item number 14, Sarah Sinclair, who is the acting general manager of Auckland Emergency Management, and we are receiving this report, so I'll move accordingly. Do I have a seconder? Councillor Simpson. And Sarah, I'll get you to outline where we've got to, and we've got the written report, but the written report indicates that you'll be providing further detail, particularly around, and I've asked for a couple of other things around the effect of the smoke, the effect of the water contamination, the effect on residents and businesses, and whether we have an update as to when we might expect the investigation to report, and whether we have any further information on the timing of reconstruction, or whether there has been a structure integrity report yet to determine what the scope of the work that has to now be done is. So you may or may not have answers to all of those questions, but if you'd like to address those. Thank you, Sarah.
Through the Chair, thank you very much. And I'm afraid that a lot of this is still work in progress. So I'll tell you what we know so far, but a lot of it is still work in progress. So from an emergency response perspective, the response worked really well. As emergency management, our initial focus was early understanding, and we were invited to put a member of emergency response team into the incident response, so we had really good two-way information the whole time. And police, fire, St John's were all on site dealing with the people who'd been evacuated, the road closures, as well as the fire itself. The alarm went from a 4-alarm to a 6-alarm really quickly, and the 6-alarm fire, which is how the fire service rate them, was the highest rated fire we've had in Auckland. So it was a big fire. And obviously the effects of the smoke and the impacts of the firefighting on traffic then led to wider road closures. A key point about the smoke is that from the fire service perspective, all smoke is toxic. And this is because the smoke particles have soot in them, which is just the right size to go into your lungs, and for the smaller particles to actually be absorbed by your bloodstream. But that doesn't mean that the fire was burning any toxic chemicals. When we look at the water quality testing, it actually had the same sorts of things that we'd expect to see from any building fire. But the messaging from fire, which is their standard message, which they're really keen to keep, is that all smoke is toxic. And I think that led to quite a lot of concerns expressed from the public and media because of the perception that it must be toxic because of chemicals. So we did get queries from quite far afield about what the effects would be on things like water supplies, as well as water runoff into the harbour. And that's okay, because we were actually getting really good information from our in-house experts and from Auckland Public Health, and all working closely together on the messaging and stuff like that. But it is entirely understandable that people were concerned with these questions. Auckland Council, like many buildings in the central area, closed down our air conditioning intakes fairly early on. From sort of post-fire recovery, part of what all buildings had to do with air conditioning was to go through and flush their filters and things like that, which does impact on things like business continuity. So it was quite important to shut them off early, but obviously that impacted on the people in the building, and for that reason and for the effects on traffic, we were advising people to work in other places if they could, because of the congestion impacts from closing the roads in particular. And also any chronic illness sufferers were advised to keep away from the smoke particularly. In terms of, so the the fire service worked really, really hard to contain the fire. It was, and after that, to get their own investigators onto the site. So they gave the site back to Fletcher Construction last Friday, and Fletcher Construction are now conducting their investigation of the safety. That investigation hasn't progressed far enough along yet for our building inspectors to be involved. And the fire services investigation, although the site part is finished, the rest of the investigation continues. So everyone is still at that investigating stage of the next parts. In terms of the progress from response to recovery, Auckland Emergency Management and the Fire and Emergency New Zealand are working together on recovery planning, and that recovery planning is looking at, amongst other things, the effect on the local residents, people who live there and the businesses around there, and on some of the how people are going with clearing the air and eliminating odour from inside their buildings, because the smell of smoke lingers long after any of the effects. Again, that's not unsafe. It's similar to, in the words of one of our experts, buying a new sofa that's been treated with fabric treatment and it smells for a couple of days. But understanding what the impacts are on the wider sector is part of the recovery planning that we're developing with the fire service at the moment. The water quality, there were concerns expressed about the water quality, again, I think because of in part because of the messaging from the smoke. Fens are allowed to discharge into the environment, but we were lucky that we were all able to work together to seek to manage effects. But the water quality had trace elements of the sorts of things that come from timber burning, which you get in a house fire, rather than anything more significant. We had early discussions with Mana Whenua on the Friday about the impacts of discharging water, because the basement, the structure of the building meant that as the fire was full, the basement filled with water, which left us with an issue of how to discharge a basement full of water. But working across the council group with Healthy Waters and Water Care, a solution was found for that managed the low level of contamination that was in the water. That's basically what we know for now, I'm afraid. We are still in the investigation process.
So if I can just put the first question up. So we've got three investigations. One is by Fletcher's, one is by the Fire and Emergency New Zealand, and one is by the insurance companies. We don't have any timing for the outcome of any of those three investigations.
No, I spoke to the head of fire yesterday, and I spoke to our building consent people yesterday, who will be brought into. They've been in contact with Fletcher's, but they'll be brought into the Fletcher's one. But they aren't ready for our inspectors to come to site yet. And the Fens one are still having interviews with people, although they're not. They're off of the site, and they've given the site back to Fletcher's. Yeah.
And presumably, the second question, there's no work happening on the site at the moment other than clean-up. So they have to wait till they can determine what the structural integrity of levels 6 and 7 are. Is that correct? So Fletcher's, I think, originally said might not commence construction for a couple of months. Is that your understanding?
Through the chair, we won't know until the investigations are complete. So they've got people on site at the moment checking the integrity, but we won't know how long it's going to take them. We've got road closures around the site at the moment, and we don't have a programme for when those road closures are due to be lifted yet. Again, I spoke to Auckland Transport yesterday. about that because we're waiting to hear back from Fletcher's about when they'll finish their integrity inspections on site.
And the road closures are about just in case there's any effect on the integrity of the building, for example, the glass panels,
Yes, they are.
and access to the site, because I think most of us who use that street are quite keen that it should be opened at the earliest opportunity. Okay, questions. First question from Councillor Coombe.
Date from what I know is a very challenging incident, and thank you also for the opportunity to come and do a tour of the emergency response centre while the fire was happening. So I did appreciate seeing how it all came together, because that was all new to me. And I did just want to acknowledge, just before I do have a question, but I did just want to acknowledge the Mayor as well, just for fronting the incident, and I thought you did that very ably and effectively, and how you were right there, available for giving updates.
I couldn't help it. I just had to look out the window.
Yeah, no.
It was all unfolding in front of me.
I thought you did a great job. So it seemed, lots of people came on board and did what they needed to do, and impressed to see all the volunteers around council as well who come to the response centre, which is quite phenomenal. But the question I did have, and I know you've got it in the report to say that the local board's going to be following up on the effects of the fire with the local community. So I'm sure you're aware there's been quite a lot of feedback from city centre residents who just felt that they were very much out of the loop and sidelined, and that there was kind of the response in terms of the communications was very much focused on commuters, visitors, and the immediate, workers on the fire, but that residents got just a bit forgotten and were sort of lumped together with people who've had very different needs, and that the messaging around just keeping windows shut for 3 days and don't going out was just didn't really acknowledge the life of 60,000 people who do live in the city centre now. And it wasn't helped as well because the media tends to start talking about the CBD, and we don't have a CBD, we have a very lively city centre, that just creates more sensitivity. So I guess my question is, I think it's more than just the fire effects, it's just what are we looking at in terms of how the improving communications, whether you're talking to the city centre residents group, and what you'd see kind of going forward. Thanks.
Through the chair, and I am going to present the same report to the Waitemata local board this afternoon. Through the chair, I think for any emergency, the first 24 hours is always difficult because you're actually dealing with what information do we know. So the first 24 hours, we always tend to focus on as soon as we know stuff, everyone else knows stuff. So all of the comms is about how quickly can we get information out to people. So it does tend not to be that targeted. It's just sort of let's get the information out to who knows it. We are working with city centre businesses and residents, often through apartment owners, as part of the recovery plan, because emergency management is always one of those things where we every time there's things you could improve for next time, and how we engage, particularly with building owners that have lots of occupants, as opposed to the individual one-on-one residents who have more control over their environments, will be something we're taking through recovery.
Thank you. Councillor Henderson.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and thank you for that update. Just a very quick question. Do we have any information on engagement with nearby businesses and more information, and whether there was a recommendation to evacuate employees from any businesses?
Through the chair, our predominant recommendations were around people switching off their aircon, so they didn't draw smoke into their buildings for a variety of reasons. And the recommendations were also to people not to travel into the city centre, but not because of the effects of the smoke, more because of the effects of the congestion. So we didn't go out to people and recommend that they evacuated. Some buildings chose to evacuate, not least because they'd switched their air conditioning off.
Much. Councillor Davi.
Thank you. Look, at the outset, I'd like to acknowledge all the staff that have been involved with this. Chief Executive, your team was just remarkable in responding to this, Sarah. Thank you for the work.
Thank you.
We haven't, and hopefully we never see another fire incident like this in Auckland. It was just unbelievable watching it unfold from level 26. And I want to acknowledge the Mayor, as Councillor Coombe did as well. Mayor, it was really great. I mean, no, it wasn't great. It was just great to have you in that position, that eye in the sky position, where you could actually be the conduit, from the leader of the city, telling Aucklanders via media, what was unfolding. And you did that quite vividly, and I want to acknowledge that. I'm surprised that the Australians haven't called you up and asked you to come over.
I'd be out of my depth there.
Look, I'm just looking forward. I've read a lot, yeah, and I don't joke about that. It is a really serious situation in Australia. Just looking forward, I've read a lot of media reports, and there's a lot of threads here, and I'm thinking there's a Fire and Emergency New Zealand review of the fire, and it would be reviewing how they responded and what resource they had in reserve. I understand there was almost no resource in reserve. Everything was allocated to the fire, but I might be wrong there. I guess I'm really interested in looking at that review and whether the scope of that review, if there's an opportunity for us to contribute to that. Because one of the things that I was starting to think about in the weeks following the fire was, if there was another incident on top of that, would fire and emergency be able to respond? So, e.g. Guy Fawkes grass fires, etc., if they had fallen in that period. And I'm just really wondering whether we need to also make inquiry with Fire and Emergency New Zealand about how resourced they are to respond to the growing Auckland. I'm not aware of any new, city centre fire stations. I understand one of the aerial units was in for maintenance. It took 2 hours to get to scene. I understand another aerial unit came up from Hamilton. So questions about, do we have fire and emergency resource to match the growing Auckland, the new vertical Auckland? I think we need to ask those questions pretty early on. I'm very interested in that. The density of population in the city centre is very different to how it was 10 years ago. Do Fire and Emergency know that? Have we communicated that there is a different way of living and being in the Auckland city centre? And it goes well beyond business, as Councillor Coombe reminds us. There's questions about training. I've read reports about maybe some firefighters weren't necessarily trained to go up the aerial units, but they were up the aerial units. There's been media coverage of exhaustion of firefighters, that a firefighter was maybe asleep in the aerial unit just due to exhaustion. Now, I don't know how accurate some of that media reporting is, and I don't want to suggest that it is all accurate, but I think there's some threads to follow there. And then there's the question of the support for firefighting personnel. Stories of no toilet facilities in the streets, no food supply. I had a contact from somebody saying, can we organise, to drop food off to firefighters? And I replied, I said, look, I'm sure Fire and Emergency have all of that catered for, but maybe not. So there's things like that, the health checks for those personnel. There's reports of 95% of firefighters being exposed to smoke inhalation. I don't know for what periods. So maybe we could say that's not our responsibility, but they are all citizens of Auckland. All those firefighters, other than maybe the ones that came from Hamilton, and I'm sure they came from other parts of the Waikato and possibly Northland, but they are all our citizens, and I think we have a responsibility to just look past our usual mandate here in engaging in the multiple inquiries that will take place here. So I've laid a few questions there, Sarah. I'm just wondering if we have that opportunity to ask those questions.
Through the chair, I'll answer a couple of different bits of those. First of all, although this didn't make its way into the media, there were other fires that the fire service were responding to at the same time. There was actually on the Tuesday, while that fire was breaking out, there was actually a fire alarm from a kitchen fire down the other end of Albert Street, for example. So we do actually have evidence of the fire service responding to other fires while that fire was going, because that one came into the control room while we were having a meeting, so we were aware of it and the response. In terms of how Auckland has evolved, I know from the generic Auckland emergency management and the CDEM perspective that the Fire and Emergency New Zealand is well resourced in Auckland. Some of the other elements that you raise, I'm sure will come up in the inquiry, and to reassure you, we've agreed at the coordinating executive, which works across the civil defence sector, that all of the parties will do their own lessons learned, and then we will amalgamate those cross Auckland lessons. We work very closely with the coordinating exec, not just in meetings but in workshops as well, to make sure that we are on a constant evolution and constant learning process, because all of these things are good learning opportunities always.
Thank you very much for that. I think they're all really good questions, and I just want to convey that it was not only Ron Devlin that was the main CEO that said it to me, but a number of the other experienced officers as well, that over their entire firefighting career they'd never worked in such a difficult, complex and big fire in their lifetime. And it is new, but it may not be the last time, and it really will be important to get those lessons. I know the Firefighters Union have raised a number of issues. Well, maybe there's a bit of lobbying going on there, but we do need to know that we are properly set up, and I think getting that report back and absorbing that, and another aspect of that will also be, a couple of us looked at the material that was the acoustic baffle in the ceiling, and it's the stuff that I would light a fire with. It's like kindling, except it's straw. And, as a layperson, I think, is that the right thing to be doing? Is that, to have flammable material like that in it? Is this an extraordinary and unusual event, or is this a risk because Spark Arena has the same material? So I think we will be looking for those wider answers when we've seen the reviews as well. And, sorry, Councillor.
No, sorry, I just was recommending.
One that built the House of Straw. Councillor Fletcher, I think it's the last. Oh no, it's not the last comment.
Thank you, Your Worship. And in requesting this report, I would like to thank Sarah and to convey my support for the comments that have been made thus far in terms of the commendations of the response in an extraordinary set of circumstances by all parties. But in asking you for this report, I was also asking you to help us understand the status of other events that we have coming in Auckland and how we are going to be able to respond appropriately. So there were two sections to my request for information. Obviously, hosting APEC and so forth, we are very fortunate to have the Aotea Centre and other facilities and things, and they're not ones that I want to direct to you, Sarah. So just seek your guidance, Your Worship. The other part of the information that I sought.
That's a very valid question. I'll ask Stephen to comment on that, just to reaffirm that the Prime Minister asserted very clearly on a visit up here that there was no question other than that Auckland would host APEC. We're the only centre in New Zealand capable of doing that. 10,000 people in Leaders Week. The good news is that we will have the hotel accommodation because we've been building 1,000 hotel rooms a year, and I think the Horizon Hotel has not been seriously affected, and Graham Stevens said to me that he hoped that he would have that up and running before the convention centre. But I'm working on the assumption that given the delays that were already occurring, that we will not have the International Convention Centre ready by the end of 2021. If I'm wrong, I'm happy to be proved wrong.
Yeah.
But that there is a plan, there was always a plan B, even before the fire, where Council and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs have been working together and have alternative arrangements, of which we can't say a huge amount, one for security reasons and two for commercial reasons. But I will ask Stephen to speak to the point.
Yep, thanks, Chair. Yes, so APEC organisers is obviously have been very active. APEC is being organised by the government. We do have a place at the CEO table and are on a number of the organising groups. And as Mayor Phil said, there was already sufficient concern about the planned opening date for the International Convention Centre that had triggered alternative plans, and those plans are in place and they're confidential, and the Prime Minister has made it really clear that APEC will be hosted in Tamaki as planned. We are members of the Destination Auckland Leaders Group, which is all of our major tourist and visitor industry leaders. Graham Stevens is on that group as well, and Deputy Mayor Cashmore and I have been participating in that group since the launch of Destination 2025 last year. We have a subgroup from that Destination Auckland group looking at this next 2 to 3 year period in particular, and they're going to look at things, for example, would it be wise to do a pop-up that would, if we used it for 2 to 3 years, it will probably be a commercially viable proposition. So we have lots of business that is booked into Auckland over the next 3 years, and it's a very small number of conventions that have been displaced by a later opening date for the International Convention Centre. So there is still, amongst our hotels and other facilities, the bulk of the convention business will continue, and the Mayor's mentioned that there is significant growth of hotel rooms coming on stream in the next 3 years as well. So I think we have asked that subgroup to report back to us by December with their preliminary thinking about how do we make sure that, you know, convention planners around the world know that Auckland is open for business, and that there's actually not much that is missing. Because we hadn't actually got the International Convention Centre opened, that will come, it'll just come later, and that we're very much open for business, and there's no reason not to be planning to come to Auckland. Keep in mind that a very significant proportion of the smaller conventions that come to Auckland are in fact domestic activity, and they have no doubt that Auckland is open for business, and there'll be a campaign sort of modelled around that theme of making sure that we get as much business as we possibly can. We just have to wait a bit longer for the International Convention Centre to open.
Thank you. Thank you for that, Mr. Town. You preempted my second question, because obviously APEC is one, but it is all of the other types of events that we are wanting to seek to attract to Auckland. So on that, do you count the Australian market as a domestic market, or is the domestic market solely New Zealand?
Yeah, I think I'm correct. Domestic is New Zealand.
Okay. And the second part of that question, interesting when you talk about a pop-up, but are you anticipating that there will be any pressure on council through the RFA or other entities and any expense that will be required that was unanticipated as a result of this?
So the people have been looking at the idea of a pop-up facility in Auckland anyway, because we've allocated the Viaduct Event Centre to Emirates Team New Zealand, and there is pressure, on the cloud because it's not exactly fit for purpose, really. So some exploration has already taken place, which was just coincidental, not triggered by the fire. And there are some pop-up options. One that was deployed in Sydney while their convention centre was being rebuilt, that we've got enough business in Auckland to make the cost of a pop-up very close to a break-even commercial proposition. I think where council might play a role across the family is perhaps assisting with where we place it, and that we facilitate making that an easy thing to achieve, not a hard thing to achieve. But I don't think capital or lease contributions of any magnitude will appear for us to meet and have to adjust budgets.
Thank you, Mr. Tan. That's really informative for us all. Could I request, Your Worship, that this be a matter that comes back to the governing body as more information is available?
Yeah, I think that once we get the reports and we can have that cross-Auckland amalgamation of those reports that Sarah has talked about, it'll be a good time to come back and have this discussion, both over the consequences of the fire, the preventative things that might need to be put in place, but also the impact of the further delay in the convention centre. It could well be that for RFA it's not a cost but a revenue benefit, because their facilities will be in full use, I'm sure, through the period. No, but very happy to do that. Last comment, second to last comment, Councillor Simpson.
Oh, thank you, Your Worship. Look, just before I ask my question, I had forgotten until Councillor Fletcher spoke that she'd actually asked for this report, so I'd be very happy if she wants to second it, the resolutions.
It's outcomes. It's not so much about who's claiming the credit for it.
But
Thanks.
I'm making that point. But my question is to you, and I'd just like to thank you along with everybody else for the work that you've done. My question is around us as a council and the process that we had for our staff and our people at Albert Street and the way that went. Are you confident that everything went really well with regards to getting the message out to the people in the building pretty much right next door, and that have you had any learnings from that, or you're really confident, you're really confident that the processes that we had worked well?
A good question, thank you, through the chair. We were very close to the fire, as the mayor said, you could see it out of the window. But the scale of fire was unprecedented. So anything where, in an emergency management sense, you're dealing with something unprecedented, there will always be learnings, whatever you do. That's not to say it didn't go well, but there will always be learnings. That's the nature of what we do. We were very quick to do things like close down the air conditioning systems, which in the long term for us made it much easier to go back to the building. So that was good. We initiated crisis management really early on. Whilst the emergency management is dealt with by the emergency management group, the ELT initiate crisis management for the council. So we initiated that and worked alongside Auckland Emergency Management on dealing with how we communicate with staff, how we pursue business continuity. As part of our lessons learned as council, we are looking at how well all the different departments felt their business continuity went, and there will always be improvements, like I say, because that's the nature of what we do. But But as a response, we made a really, really quick response. And if we're thanking people, I've got to take my hat off to the property people who were amazingly responsive. They were literally coming in at between 4:30 and 5 a.m. in the mornings on the Wednesday, Thursday, Friday to check the building. So we had a really, really good response.
They were very diligent. They kept wanting to move me out of my office. Second to last question is Councillor Cooper.
Yes, Mr. Mayor, a few conversations where you were saying, well, I'm in my office, it's not very good for my breathing, but I'm still here. Anyway, so I guess the captain has to stay on the ship until it sinks. So just my question was around the pop-up, because I'm really mindful that we've got the cloud, which is a pop-up, and it's nearly 10 years old, and we've had to repair it in a recent storm. We've got no plans for it, but it cost us a fortune, and it doesn't get its full use. Would we be really being quite careful around what we spend on a pop-up and being really clear about how long it lasts, and, you know, not having to have a maintenance plan for a pop-up? So we've already got one down on Queen's Wharf.
Yeah, I think through you, Chair, look, the issue of a pop-up, just keep in mind, this is just to manage the anticipated growth of convention business in Auckland, and it would have a finite, you know, opening and removal date. I think if we were to reflect on the cloud, what do we like about it, what we don't like about it, you know, we wouldn't do that again. So we've learned some lessons about what pop-up can mean, and you can often get stuck with a pop-up if you're not really clear about why you've got it, what it's being used for. And keep in mind, and we'd be very firm that this would need to stand on its own 2 feet commercially, because again, if you subsidise it, then the facility may well end up wanting to stay there for much longer than it should.
Thank you. Okay, I think the last comment from Councillor Walker. We've had quite a lot of time on this now. Councillor Walker.
Got a couple of questions. The first one just goes to reporting back to us around the pollution aspects, particularly in the water of the event. And the other related issue that would interest me, given that there was a significant volume of water used, is if there was going to be a backflow event in Auckland, certainly in the CBD area, something like that would trigger it. And those events do happen. So I'd just be interested to know whether there have been any incidents of contamination reported in any buildings in the CBD. So I just mentioned that in passing. It has happened before, sometimes with tragic consequences. And the other question I've got that I did raise earlier around this event is that the Central City area is hurting already in respect of Albert Street and disruption from any number of issues around building activity, and this event adds to that. And I just asked the question around what our strategy is around that, and that's our strategy as a city over and above the heart of the city, because it must have had a significant effect and will be having a significant effect.
Through the chair. The pollution aspects of the water, and of the air. When the event happened, we were actually on a high wind watch. So although the effects were felt locally, they dispersed fairly quickly. These are acute rather than sort of chronic, ongoing incidences. So the water quality monitoring and the air quality monitoring may well have had a blip, but it would have been a blip. And certainly the water quality now is back to normal, as is the air quality, but the air quality has been affected by things like Guy Fawkes. It was a significant volume of water. It was the volume of water that went onto the fire was 26.7 million litres.
Oh, that's right.
So we know that from the heat, we would expect about a third of that to disperse just from the heat, and the rest of it to run off. We haven't heard anything about building pollution. I think that there are some elements that council would have an interface with, but some that we wouldn't. You know, for example, if people were concerned about the air in their workplace in a confined environment as opposed to the open air, that would be a conversation with WorkSafe. And I'm sorry, can you re-ask me the backflow question, because I'm not sure what you were referring to.
Substantial drawdown of water, and in this instance the drawdown of water was huge. Instead of water pressure going into buildings, water can be sucked out of buildings, and if you've got cross connections, and there are any number of instances where you've got cross connections in any number of buildings, if there's a direct cross connection, the contaminant flows back and then resurfaces in another building, conceivably, or within the same building. And if people are unaware of that, often they can be poisoned, and that actually happens. So I guess my questions go to the nature of a coordinated response around this sort of event, as it goes to pollution, as it goes to the movement of other contaminants, and just what our preparedness is. And my view is our preparedness may not be that great. So there may be a number of learnings, and that's what I'd quite like to see some reporting back on. That might, for example, go to the Civil Defence Committee, for example, though whether it's Civil Defence remains to be seen. But where is it going to come?
Okay, I think maybe Civil Defence is a good place, Wayne, as your Deputy Chair. You could take it there. I think that'd be good. Just on your last point, obviously Council can't be the backstop for every disaster that happens, and we can't bail everybody out. And I don't think there was any real expectation that Council would meet extraordinary costs of lost business. It's a force majeure, really. On the issue of Albert Street, however, you'll be pleased to note that we did make progress with government, and that they have concurred with our proposal to set up a small hardship fund. And I convened a meeting with the Albert Street, or with the Heart of the City actually, and CRLL, just to make sure that CRLL knew what the expectations of Heart of the City is. We might not meet that expectation, but there will be some assistance given to extraordinary hardship cases. I have had one last request, which is from Councillor Bartley for a comment.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and through you, thank you, Sarah, for your report. I just wanted to know, if it was unprecedented, how did we prepare for it? Was there a plan? Are you satisfied with the initial response by emergency services and those other agencies that were involved? I was on the ground for about an hour just watching everything, and some people had masks, some people didn't. The ones that seemed to take control of the situation that I could see was actually the construction workers. They were the ones directing traffic, dealing with the public while the fire engines were coming in, and then the police came through. So from my own basic perspective, it didn't look like there was much coordination or leadership going on there. So just wondering what your thoughts were around that.
Through the chair. So fire was leading, and they were the lead agency in this. And from my perspective, certainly the setup of the incident response, the localised incident response, the mobilisation, all went really well. I think that any event while you are doing your initial response, that first piece of any response, while you're working out the scale of what you're responding to and stuff like that. It is one of those things that people do what they need to do. That's the nature of emergency response. But from my perspective, it was really well coordinated. The plan. Our role in emergency management as Auckland Council, as you know from being on the committee, is a coordinating role, and the coordination across the entities went really well. We had really good communications with each other, really early indicators of whether or not there were problems. So there was good communication. Was there a plan? There isn't. The way that we respond to things, the plan is to coordinate well together. I don't think there's a sort of, certainly not for emergency management. I don't know if there are plans. There aren't plans for this is what we'll do for a level 6 fire type thing. It's more about let's make a plan for how we work together, and then we can apply that to situations as they occur, because in emergencies, no two situations are going to be the same.
Thank you. In putting the resolution, can I just also acknowledge, Sarah, the work that you and your staff put in, and maybe we can, after we've passed the resolution, we can acknowledge that by acclamation. So the resolution has been moved and seconded. All those in favour, please say aye. To the contrary, no.